On this inside line, I am completely overhauling the steering system on my 2020 Jeep Gladiator. This is not only going to get rid of the obnoxious dead spot in the steering, but make it where I can easily turn these 40-inch tall trail grapplers going down the trail. All right, let's get to it. Now, the two biggest challenges I had with the stock steering system really became noticeable after I swapped out my axles and moved up to a 40-inch tall tire. Now, the first one is an on-road annoyance, and it really has a lot to do with the factory aluminum gearbox that these things come with. The big issue being, as you're going down the highway, let's say 60 miles an hour, the Jeep has a dead spot in the steering wheel, and that basically means you can move it with that much play and nothing's happening. What that essentially equates to is you're often correcting constantly to keep this thing going straight down the road. And that's super obnoxious, especially when you're driving really long distances like I like to do. So that was already an issue I knew that needed to be addressed. Now, off-road, there was a different challenge, and it really had to do with I like to run about 8 PSI in these 40-inch trail grapplers on the trail. Now, at that low of air pressure, the Jeep's going to perform really well, the tire's going to hook up well, and it's going to ride really nice. All positives. The challenge is, whenever you're on a trail, and especially in a high traction scenario, the steering's going to be very heavy. And I have found with this low air pressure and with my front Eaton E-locker engaged, it can overwhelm the steering to the point where it just won't move. You have no steering whatsoever. And so I knew I needed to address those things because I like to wheel this thing, and I obviously need to be able to steer easily off-road with the front locker engaged. So that's sort of how I came to, I needed a steering upgrade. I needed to look at what options were available for the steering upgrade. And at the end of the day, I needed to swap out the factory gearbox. That was really the core of a lot of the problems with the steering system. So what did I do? Well, I went back with basically a same style steering upgrade that I've used for many years in the past, and that is a hydraulic assist steering system. And if you're not familiar with what that is, it essentially retains a lot of how the factory steering is configured in terms of you still have a steering gearbox, a drag link, a tie rod, all of those mechanical parts are still there. What it does is introduces a hydraulic ram into your steering equation, and this ram mounts down at the axle to your tie rod, and what it's going to do is assist you when you turn the wheel. That ram is going to basically guide that tie rod left or right, so it takes away a lot of the stress and really strain that you're putting on your sector shaft and your gearbox when you're out turning this thing off-road. And in my experience, it's really the best and most effective way to make the Jeep drive really well off-road, where you don't have to worry about tire pressure and the axle being locked. And it essentially acts like the world's greatest steering stabilizer on road, keeping everything really nice and tight. So for the Gladiator, what I ended up doing is getting a full kit from PSC Motorsports. They make a full bolt-in complete replacement system for the Gladiator. Now, when I say complete replacement, I'm not kidding here. It is a complete replacement because the Gladiators come from the factory with an electronically assisted steering system. And what this means is you don't have an engine-driven pump like has been the mainstay for many years. You actually have a pump that sits on the side of the frame that's electronic, and the computer tells it when it needs more pressure or less, and that's really what's helping your steering system along. And you have to replace all of that. So I want to go ahead and let you know this is a fairly long job in terms of you're going to have to completely delete your old steering system and bolt in a new system. The good news is it's not very difficult. the, I guess, not so great news if you're installing it at your house, you need to plan probably a full weekend to do the steering upgrade. It's you can do it with one person, as you'll see I have. It's very difficult to film this install with one person, but it's definitely doable. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through, to the best of my ability, the basic upgrades and the reason for the different components for the steering kit, and then I'm going to give you my full review on how this thing works, how it's changed the on-road driving and the off-road driving. I now have around 7,000 plus miles on this steering system. I've driven it from here in North Carolina to Moab, Utah. I had a nice trip to Wind Rock, so I've been able to put some legitimate off-road and on-road miles with this kit. I want to give you a full kind of breakdown of where I really think this made a huge difference. Are there any drawbacks? That whole deal. So let's get into swapping out your steering system. Now, the first thing you'll need to do is remove the grille of the Jeep. This is easily accomplished. All you'll need is a flathead screwdriver to release the plastic rivets or push-in pins, whatever you want to call them, at the top of the grille, and then you'll simply unclick the grille from the bottom. After you remove that, what I recommend doing is removing the headlights. This is actually going to give you really good access to the steering components behind there. It's only 3 bolts and 1 plug, so it's definitely worth doing. Your next step is to remove the intake assembly completely. So this is going to be your air box and the entire hose assembly to where it actually connects to the throttle body. You'll have a couple clips that are going to tie in the mass airflow sensor. You just need to pop those out. A small trim tool or just plastic trim tool will get this out of there pretty easily. At the front, you'll find a few additional bolts that hold the air intake guide. You'll want to pop that out as well. The first thing you're going to want to do is unbolt the factory power steering reservoir, and that's just 1 bolt that keeps that in place. From there, you're going to disconnect the harness that plugs into the power steering pump. Now, before you can remove the pump itself, you'll need to remove an additional fender brace bracket, and this also is what holds the bottom of the air box. Just a few bolts to get this out, not a big deal. Now, before removing the pump, I recommend going after the lines because you're going to be removing all of the power steering lines in general. You have a couple at the front side of the frame and you have 2 at the back side. These are a lot more obvious once you're there. I've got an aftermarket front bumper with a winch, so it was pretty easy to access these. At this point, you'll go ahead and remove the pressure line that's mounted to the pump, and you can go ahead and start actually removing the 2 bolts that hold the pump in place. Now, with the pump removed, I started my journey of removing the stuff from the front of the engine. This is all necessary because you're going to be adding on a new serpentine belt along with a full pulley that's going to be mounting on the side of the engine. So the first thing you'll need to do here is remove the vacuum pump that sits between the front of the block and the radiator. Once you get that out of the way, you can move to unbolting the alternator. To actually take the belt off, it will require removing the alternator. What I did here is unbolted it, and then I used a bungee strap to keep it securely in place, using something at the firewall to kind of keep it back. Now, once that's done, you'll have to pop out the mount for that sits right below it. And then after that is done, you can actually pull off the serpentine belt. And take note of how this thing is routed, because you're going to basically have to route it very similarly. Instead of just that dead pulley, it's now going to go on a pump. More on that here in a minute. Now, at this point, you can go ahead and start breaking down some of the hardware that's secured to the gearbox. So that's going to be your drag link. From there, you will take off the steering column sleeve that goes over the factory gearbox. That's just a single bolt. You'll just need to pry that back out of the way. Be sure to keep that bolt in a place that you can find it. Next thing that I did was get onto the two lines that are feeding into the gearbox. You've got a pressure and return line here. I found it easiest to go from the top of the engine to break these free. Once they are free from the gearbox, you'll just do a little bit of fishing to get the lines back out. At this point, you can keep the pitman arm on the steering gearbox because you're not going to be reusing that, and you can use a impact or whatever you have to remove the 4 bolts that are securing the stock gearbox in place. The one nice thing about it being aluminum, it's fairly easy to get out, and I used basically to route it with the suspension out and the tires and wheels off. I was able to get it sort of over the axle and then pull it out that way. Now the next thing to remove is the idler pulley that actually bolts to the engine block. You're going to be removing this and not using it again because this is where the new engine driven pump from PSC is going to mount. Now you're going to have to remove this, and you're going to have to remove the motor mount. Now this is where you got to be super careful. Now I'm using a floor jack and a block of wood to raise the engine to kind of get some of the stress off of it. You'll start with unbolting the motor mount, and then from there you actually have to get the mount off of the side of the block. Again, none of this is hard, it's just nuts and bolts. It's a little tight to get your hand in there. I've got small hands, so it wasn't that bad, but you can't really reach a impact in here to get to this. Be very careful when you are jacking the engine up. On the driver's side, there is a emissions sensor for the EGR that sits very close to the back of the block. I learned this the hard way, that if you raise the engine too much, you will bend the tabs and potentially break that sensor. Now, as I mentioned, you have a engine-driven pump, and to mount that engine-driven pump, PSC made their own motor mount that allows the pump to bolt directly to it. Now it will require a little relief. As you can see here, you're gonna notch out this spot. This is just to make sure that the engine, it's gonna move a little bit under torque. It's gonna keep that bracket mount away from this mount. So I took a angle grinder, cleaned it up, and then painted it. It really wasn't a big deal. The next thing will be installing the engine-driven pump to your new motor mount. After this, you can actually start the reassembly of the front of the engine with your accessory drives. I went ahead and kind of got my belt roughly in place. Now I will say that it takes a fair amount of pressure to get that belt on. So it's another one of those deals where if you have another set of hands, it'd make it a little easier. The big part of this kit, which is by far the heaviest and a bit challenging to install by yourself, is the cast iron gearbox. These things are massive. You have a larger sector shaft for this. It also comes with a new pitman arm that's specific for the JT and JL. The big thing to note here is it doesn't require any modification. It does come with 3 new bolts, and you will reuse one of the old bolts. Once you get that installed, you're ready to move on to the actual fluid reservoir, which is going to mount in the stock location of the pump. Now this fluid resi you'll assemble mostly on the bench. All of the hoses come labeled, so you'll know exactly where they go. There's no guesswork here, and you'll literally bolt everything in place. The 2 hoses that are attached to the back, you have one that's going to go to the pump, and you have another one that's going to go to the fluid reservoir that is the feed line for that. The small hose that's at the very front of it is actually a drain. Now, once you have the resi in, you can go ahead and start plumbing your new lines that come with the kit. This kit does come with a cooler. I'll show you more about that in a second. So you've got a high pressure line, and then you've got a low pressure return that goes to the box. Everything is labeled, not a complicated process here. The big thing to note is just get everything tightened by hand at first. Make sure that the lines aren't getting put in a weird position, and then you can go back and tighten everything up once it's all done. That's really, in my opinion, kind of the right way to do it. Now, once I got the pitman arm up, I went ahead and got the lines that come pre-cut for the hydraulic assist ram, threaded those onto the box, and then started hooking up the ram to the axle. Now my axle comes with a mount. It was an option that I picked that allows you to just bolt up a cylinder, and if you tell PSC the size of your tie rod, they will send you the correct clamp, so literally there's no welding or anything. I opted to just bolt it in where Dynatrac already had the mount. I didn't see a problem with that, given that there's also a skid plate for this ram. I'm not at all worried about it, and I can tell you just from having this thing and wheeling it for the past few months, I haven't had an issue where I'm tearing that up or I've damaged anything at all. Now once you have all of the hoses attached, you can go ahead and mount the overflow breather, then start adding fluid. Now there are 3 quick things that I want to note that unfortunately I had a memory card issue and I don't have filmed, or at least not in its entirety. The first thing is, after you get the ram mounted, at least in place, you need to be able to cycle it and make sure that you got the ram in the right spot. Doing that is a little bit of a process, because you got to make sure that you're not overextending the ram and it's not collapsing too much. So I do it by turning the wheel all the way to the driver's side. That gets the ram fully out. I make sure that it's extended properly, and then I make sure that my steering stops are where they need to be. Now, on the Dynatrac ProRock XT60 axle that I have, it has steering stops on the front and back side to adjust. And it's just a bolt with washers. There's nothing complicated to it. The big thing to note here is you want to make sure that you do really each one at a time. Don't just say, oh, I needed 2 washers on that, I need 2 washers on that, because these steering setups, the way it's configured, doesn't actually sweep evenly. So do one at a time. Even if you have a stock axle, you need to adjust your bump stop so you don't overrun the ram or have an issue with the gearbox. I had actually someone that it follows the channel that had asked me about, did I lose any steering radius when I put this gearbox in versus the stock one? And that's a really good question, because he had a similar axle setup that I do. And the honest answer to that is, while I did have to adjust the steering stops out on this axle when I put in the new gearbox and ram assist, I never checked them when I had my stock gearbox in here. I just ran them however Dynatrac sent them. And so I actually don't know if the factory gearbox had enough throw to give me the full potential of the 50 degrees of operating angle or turning angle for these knuckles. So that's just the honest truth. I don't know if the stock gearbox, if I lost any in terms of that. It doesn't really feel much different. I don't feel like I've lost, and I'm not rubbing or not rubbing. Everything seems about the same. So that's all I can say for that. The other 2 things very important here is bleeding the steering system. It is a very time-consuming process, but the way you have to do it is you're going to pour fluid in. They send a specific SWEPCO fluid for you to use, and basically what's going to happen is you're going to pour the fluid in as much as you can initially, and then you're going to, with the axle on jack stands, cycle the wheel back and forth, all the way lock, all the way lock. You'll do that about 10 times each. Then you'll check the fluid, add a little bit more. Do it, and you'll hear it, gurgling constantly. Once you get to a point where the fluid's not really dropping, you'll actually turn the wheel straight, and then you'll fire up the Jeep for about a minute. Don't turn the wheel, don't do anything like that, and then cut it off. And PSC recommends letting the Jeep rest for about 10 minutes. So this is where it gets to become kind of a time-consuming process. You'll let it cool down, check the fluid after it's cool, do the same thing again where you cycle the wheel back and forth, trying to get all the air bubbles out of it. Then once it doesn't look like you're dropping fluid, crank it up, let it run for a minute, and then kind of repeat until it's done. I have a solid hour in getting fluid, the air out of the system. And you will know if you still have air in it because you will hear that pump whine, and it's very loud when it has air in it. So if you have any noise coming from that pump, that's what's going on. You've got air in the system. The last thing that you need to know is when you're putting this system on a Gladiator, obviously you've unplugged the factory module, and it's looking for that pump. The way you have to tell the computer that it's not there anymore is to use a taser from Z Automotive. You'll go into your controls, the same place that you modify your tire size and gear input, and you're basically just going to tell it, no, it doesn't have electronic steering anymore. It's really that simple. But you have to do it or you'll have all sorts of engine lights and problems. So that's a little something, but very important. I think the best way to tackle how this thing does on road is to simply show you. And the biggest thing you're going to notice right out of the gate is that dead spot that is notorious in the Gladiators with the aluminum gearbox is completely gone. When you turn the wheel, any movement that you make, the steering is going to be incredibly responsive. So that part of it is a big change, and I love it. It does take a little getting used to because you know, especially with the 40s, I was kind of used to having to constantly correct. This, you don't have to do that anymore. And having driven this thing, you know, for about 7,000 miles with this setup on it, and that includes a cross-country adventure and some adventures to Tennessee, I'm very happy with how this thing drives on road. I think it's a huge improvement over what this thing was with the aluminum gearbox. It's not overly sensitive. It definitely isn't heavy. It's kind of that perfect right in between where it's just easy to drive and it's not obnoxious in any way, shape, or form. You know, it's one of those deals where most people are going to invest in a hydraulic assist steering system for off-road. I get that. That's why I've always done it. But I can tell you, having driven plenty of miles with the aluminum gearbox and having this with this iron box and the hydraulic assist, even if you just didn't do anything else but swap in the iron gearbox, it's going to make a huge difference in how tight the steering is. And I really like the on-road manners. It's not slow or twitchy. It's kind of perfect right there in the middle. Even if you're cruising mountain roads, going back and forth, this thing has been great. I've never experienced any overheating with the steering system. Everything on road with it has been great. You know, reliability is a big deal for me. I drive this thing cross country. I don't trailer it. I like to be able to go hit hard trails and drive it home. And, you know, even as seemingly complex as the system is and as much work that it took to put it on there, I haven't had any leaks. It's been very easy to kind of see and inspect the system, so you get a lot of confidence with it. I do keep a spare belt with me just in case, but I've always done that as a, you know, fail-safe anyhow. But overall, on-road improvements, if you're just looking to improve your on-road steering because you hate how your Jeep drives on road, this is going to make a big difference with that. And again, you can let go of the wheel. There's no shake or shimmy. I still don't have these 40s balanced. You know, everything you see here is basically fresh after my big trip from Moab, and this thing is just easy to drive, and I've got no complaints about it. So anybody that's considering this just to improve on-road drivability, I think it's well worth it. Now, off-road, the difference was immediate. Compared to driving with the stock steering system at 8 PSI to this, it is a literal night and day improvement. The big thing here is even with the front axle locked, I can easily turn the tires off-road. In Moab, in high trashing scenarios, I never had an issue with the steering getting overwhelmed or overheating, which is a huge deal. I often find myself, especially in places like Moab, where you're spending a lot of time getting to the trail and then a full day on the trail. So I was definitely curious, would I have any overheating issues with the steering? Would there be a problem there? And I have not experienced a single problem, so very happy to report that. Even with the front axle engaged and super low tire pressure, I've never found a scenario where the steering feels overwhelmed. I do like the fact that it gives you a very natural feedback in the wheel, so it's not as though it's masking or overpowering something, so you're going to get yourself into a situation where you might bind the axle and not realize it. It's a very almost like a super stock steering, in that it doesn't feel like you've got this hydraulic ram on there, which is really nice. It just feels nice and tight, like a really good steering system, but you know that when you need that extra boost, it's already there. It's never a surprise. It doesn't have any, you don't have to rev it up really high to get, you know, good steering off-road. Even at low RPMs, the steering works very well. At the end of the day, the kit did exactly what I needed it to do. It made this thing drive better on the highway and took away all of the sort of heavy steering that this thing had on the trail. So for that, I am very happy. Now, if you are on the fence, if you want to go with a hydraulic assist system, or if you're just looking to make the steering better and you don't feel like you need the ram, you can actually buy this kit without the ram and just upgrade the gearbox and do the engine-driven pump, and you can upgrade to the actual ram later down the road. So for you guys that are running 37s that maybe are feeling that same slackness in the steering, I definitely highly recommend, at the very least, moving up to a gearbox upgrade. Again, you're going to get that bigger sector shaft. It's a full cast piece, so you don't have to worry about it being a lighter duty box like that aluminum one. So definitely worth it. Again, it is a time-consuming install when you're doing it one person. It's also worth noting I'd never done one of these before, so I was taking my time going through the instructions, you know, piece by piece, and I was trying to film it the best I could by myself. So you could probably do it maybe in a day if you've got somebody else helping you and you're really paying attention to what you're doing. Again, not hard, just takes some time. So something to be aware of. Now, I've got another cross-country adventure coming up pretty soon with this, and I've got some more southeast things that I'm going to be doing with this Jeep. So I hope you guys are liking these videos. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you do. You can always place a comment in the comment section if you've got any questions, or you can always find me directly at Ollie Mansour Editor on Instagram, and you can drop me a note there. Happy to help if I can. And that's about it for this episode. So hope you guys are staying safe. I'm really excited with how this thing is developing over the past couple of years. It's been a very fun Jeep, and hopefully you guys will continue to be on this journey as I kind of fine-tune it for my needs. All right, well, take care. Bye-bye.
I work hard each and every day. I get lost in the words I say. I don't push pause, no, I push play. I won't stop till I make a change. I withdraw on the things I make. I turn flaws into flawless traits. I build tall, never capped in space. I won't stop till I hear him say, oh, oh.